Welcome to the GT350 garage. Welcome to the GT350 garage. My name is Walter, and this is part 3 of engine removal from my 1966 Shelby GT350. If you haven't seen part 1, it is cooling system and peripherals, and we get the cooling system, all of the fuel parts, all of the accessories off of the engine, and get ready to really start moving some things out of the way. Part 2, we drop the exhaust and I show you how I get the headers out of the car. It's a fairly straightforward process, and some of the stuff that I share in that video might make it easier if you've never done it before. In this video, part 3, we're going to talk about getting the transmission out. I'm going to show you some of the steps, some of the tools, and some of the things that I do to make this process happen. So, with that, let's get started. Okay, so let's do a little running check, and I'm going to show you where I'm at with this thing. We're going to start back here at the back, and you can see we have no header, we have no clutch linkage. Moving on, we get down here, and you can see that we've got pretty much unobstructed access to the motor mount bolts. I'll loosen those up here real soon. Our fuel line's disconnected. We have no radiator, no fan, no coolant hoses in the front. We have no battery cables on the passenger side. Passenger side header is out. Again, we have good unobstructed access to the motor mount. Starter's out. No ground. Our heater hoses are disconnected. So basically all that's left is to remove the drive shaft, the transmission, and the bell housing, and then lift this engine out and get it on a stand. Okay, so the first step to pulling the transmission out is you need to take the shift handle off. So to do that, we're going to lift up the chrome bezel and fish the boot through it, take it off the handle, and then we're going to expose the screws underneath the boot that hold it to the floor. And you can just barely get to these screws pulling the carpet back. And if your carpet is newer carpet, this is the original, you may not be able to get to it. If it's got a plastic backing on it that's solid, you might need to lift this front section of carpet up. This carpet was previously torn. I don't know if it's because of previous transmission removal or what. The history on the carpet in this car is a little fuzzy. I have a new carpet kit for the car, and it'll be going in later, but let's get this shifter removed. All right, once you've got the shift boot up and out of the way, there's two bolts. They've got half-inch head on them that hold the shifter lever to the actual shifter assembly. You need to take those two bolts out. Pretty straightforward stuff here. Once this lever's off the transmission, pretty straightforward stuff here. Once this transmission lever or shifter so pretty straightforward stuff here. Once this shift lever's removed, then there's nothing sticking through the floor anywhere else to prevent the shifter or the transmission from coming out of the car. So I will say this, if you guys get the opportunity to buy good tools, definitely buy good tools. Alright, so there's the stock lever, and then we can see that the shifter just fell apart as I removed it. This is part of the reverse lockout, so this shifter is very worn out. The transmission is worn out, has second gear problems. So the T5 that's going in is going to be a really nice upgrade. Okay, sometimes it's the obvious stuff that escapes us. We've got pretty good access to these upper bolts on the bell housing. So to get to these, you can try and fit a ratchet in there, but in all honesty, your best bet is going to be an end wrench. Ratcheting wrenches are a good choice if you have them. If you don't, just do it the old school way and do it by hand. It'll take a couple of minutes. Ratcheting wrenches make it pretty quick. Shop around. You can get decent ratcheting wrenches pretty inexpensively these days. I want to say I picked up this set of gear wrench with metric, standard, regular length, and stubbies for under $100. And it's just shop around. And they work great. So, you know, not endorsing gear wrench or anything, but they work fine. Sometimes you got to put a little force on the bolt. Sometimes it's when you're working from across the engine bay, it's a little harder to get the force that you want. There we go. So go ahead and pull the upper bolts and get them out of your way. I know a lot of guys try and pull these bolts from down below, and that doesn't make any sense. The access up here is really good. If you're trying to do it from underneath the car, you're going to be using universals, swivels, and fighting it. And there's no reason to fight this stuff. Just do it simple. Once you feel it loosen up enough, you just throw them out by hand and get those bolts out of the way. Okay, I admit it, I goofed. Rookie YouTuber mistake. I use a remote to trigger the camera to turn the camera on when I'm filming, and it didn't turn the camera on, and I lost the footage. Well, I have no footage for the transmission removal. So really quick, I want to cover the process with you guys and just make sure you understand what you're up against, so that when you go into this, you're not surprised unexpectedly. In part one, I showed you guys that the starter was already out. And in part two, we took the clutch Z-bar linkage out, the equalizer bar, got that out of the way. And then earlier in this video, I showed you taking a couple of bolts out of the top of the bell housing and Um, Removing the shifter. You're going to remove the shift boot and then remove the 2 bolts that hold the shifter on. There's no electrical on these early cars, particularly, unless you have backup lights. You'll have a backup light switch, but that's it. Very straightforward to remove these transmissions from these cars. So, starter's out of the way, clutch linkage is disconnected, shifter's off. The next thing you got to do is take the drive shaft out. Pull the drive shaft by removing the U-bolts from the rear end. Get some masking tape, the blue painter's tape. Wrap it around the U-joint a couple of times. That'll prevent the U-joint from falling apart, all the needle bearings falling out, and having to put a new U-joint in, unless you need a new U-joint, at which point put a new U-joint in. From there, the next step is probably the most important step, and that is you need a decent transmission jack. You need something that will cradle the transmission and that you can attach the transmission to with a strap or a chain, something you can actually tighten down. You want that transmission to kind of stay on there. So get the transmission jack underneath the transmission itself, and this is where you come to a crossroads and you have a couple of options. First thing you want to do is take the nuts off of the transmission motor mount and where they go through the transmission cross member, and then you want to take the nuts off of the cross member's cross bolts. Once those are off, then the transmission cross member is pretty much ready to go and come out of the car, except on these 65, 66 cars, you've got a parking brake lever, and the cable comes out of the floor and attaches to the lever, and then your rear parking brake cable's attached to the lever. And what you have to do is grab the cable and the arm, and you have to pull the arm towards the front of the car, disconnect the cable, okay? It's not the easiest thing to do by yourself, but you can do it. And once you've got that disconnected, then you can slide the arm back, and the arm drops out of the transmission crossmember. Now the parking brake cables are out of the way. Last step. You have to decide, do you want to pull the transmission out of the bell housing, or do you want to pull the transmission with the bell housing on it? If you've never done it before, I would recommend pull the transmission out of the bell housing and then remove the bell housing. It'll just make the process easier for you. I did it with the bell housing on. So with the transmission bell housing on the engine and removing it from the bell housing, you take the 4 bolts out of the transmission, and then you're going to slide your jack and transmission back in the transmission tunnel, and the input shaft will come out of the pilot bearing and then the clutch splines, and once it's free and it moves around a little bit, you can kind of bring it back, rock it a little bit, get it out of the bell housing, lower it down, and get it out of your way. And it goes just about as fast as it sounds. It doesn't take very long at all to get the transmission out of this car. If you do it with the bell housing on the transmission, you have to be a little more careful. You're going to pull the bell housing off. It's going to make the transmission nose heavy. And then you have to pull the whole assembly back almost until it touches the firewall. At that point, you have to lower it down, and you really need somebody to give you a hand and tilt the motor a little bit so that the engine comes back and you get a little bit of angle on it so that it slides off and then everything drops out. Once you've done that, you've gotten it out of there, again, get it out of your way and you're done. Transmission's out of the car. If you've never done this before, make sure you use the right tools. And if you've never done it before and you're not comfortable doing it by yourself, get some help. Okay? Extra set of hands is going to make the process just a little bit safer, and nobody likes it when a transmission falls on them. One important note, make sure the transmission's drained completely, and use something to plug the back of the transmission tail housing. Worst case scenario, tape a big Ziploc bag around the back of the transmission to catch the fluid that's going to run out. If you're dealing with an automatic, you definitely want to drain it before you pull it. Automatic's a little bit different. You can't take the bell housing off of most automatics. So you have to kind of pull it separately. Now, if my situation removing this engine was a little bit different and I had the space to go forward with the engine crane the way I used to do it in my shop, well, at that point I'd leave the transmission on and I'd pull the engine and transmission as one complete assembly. That's the way I prefer to take them out. That's the way I prefer to put them in. But with the car situated where it is, it's about 4 feet from the bench. I simply don't have the space to do that, and I didn't want to take the car off the stands, move it out, put it back on stands, pull the engine, take it off of stands, move it back in, and so on. So, to avoid all of that extra work and get the engine out of the car in a more time-efficient manner, I did it where it is, and I pulled the transmission off the engine before I pulled it. Okay. That pretty much wraps up the transmission removal portion of this particular video series on engine removal. And I hope the information helps. If you have any questions, send me a message in the comments. You can email the GT350garage@gmail.com, or the links for Instagram and Facebook are below in the description, and you can reach me at either of those. With that, I thank everyone for watching, and I will see you in the next video.